In this edition of Hey Cool, We Still Have National Parks, I will bring your attention to Congaree National Park in South Carolina. I pulled this one out of the pile because it's a great place to find the subject of this episode, mushrooms. Located more or less in the middle of the state between Columbia and Charleston, South Carolina, along the part of the Congaree River that spreads out into bottomland and swamps. This sort of environment is rich in diverse life, plant, animal, and fungus. Since mushrooms are usually around 80% water by volume, they tend to be common and prodigious in areas with a constant water supply. And their role as decomposers is essential in the rapid nutrient cycling required in a swamp environment. The old-growth forest that is preserved in Congaree National Park is unique in an area that has long been mined for its natural riches in timber, soil, and wildlife. The complex biosphere of life around this river bottom is an important storehouse of native plant, animal, and fungus species that pull together the rich life that made South Carolina so desirable for the early colonists and the indigenous people that made their home there before colonization pushed them west. This popular park, while lacking huge canyons or tall peaks, has its own attractions with miles of rivers, creeks, and swamps. And all of this is not just great ground for growing mushrooms, it's also home to one of 3 species of synchronous fireflies. This year, the viewing events will take place from May 14th through May 21st. This is such a popular event that there's a lottery to get tickets, which, alas, has already passed. But if you're in the area or want to be, put the Firefly Viewing Lottery, which happens in early April, on your calendar for next year. And look around. There are synchronous firefly viewing events at other parks from South Carolina all the way north to Pennsylvania. And like mushrooms, fireflies like plenty of moisture too. And let's keep our parks in good shape so they can continue to provide these sorts of unique experiences here at Congaree and at hundreds of other parks around the country. Episode 145, Mushroom History, Food Edition. And what exactly is a mushroom anyway? Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at the history of mushrooms, and they have a long history of humans, but the food part of that is not that well documented. I'll also spend some time on what exactly a mushroom is and why all humans are probably living on planet fungus, and should sort out how to do a better job of that. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of a set of fungi, and that fungi are not plants, and they're not animals either. In fact, they're their own thing. But until the classification of living things became more sophisticated, they were generally classed as a plant until the middle of the 20th century. There's a much longer history of mushrooms on the American continents than the period I'm going to look at in my next episode. But much of that was initially largely lost as the Americans became the destination for adventurous Europeans. But it is being uncovered and recovered slowly as America starts to recognize the importance of specific mushrooms, fungi generally, and how a cautious and cooperative relationship with fungus will serve humans and the planet much better than the combative and controlling relationship it has unsuccessfully attempted for the last 400 years or so. The first awareness of the existence of extensive gathering and use of mushrooms for the purposes of worship and medicine in the Americas by visiting or invading Europeans goes back about 600 years. There's documentation from the middle of the 1500s by one of the many Jesuits who traveled with the conquistadors. He wrote descriptions of mushroom types collected and outlined their uses, while also condemning these activities since they were definitely unchristian and probably occult. And so much of the purpose of recording them was to accurately and actively suppress them. When these documents were rediscovered in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was some controversy about whether those earliest Spanish depictions and descriptions of these mushrooms were actually peyote cactus. After all, the cactus does have a bulbous shape reminiscent of mushrooms, and it is responsible for hallucinatory visions due to its manufacture of the alkaloid mescaline. And the first recorded uses of mushrooms were notably about how they were used in service of producing visions, added to all this confusion. Now, it was argued that because peyote grows in northern Mexico in higher and drier climates, but the recorded mushroom activity was happening in the Aztec Empire, which was down along the southern lobe of the Gulf of Mexico. But this was not really a persuasive argument, since there was already a long history in Europe of transporting both foraged and cultivated items that produce pleasurable and hallucinatory effects far from their place of origin. Europeans in the 16th century had experienced the transport of such things as opium, coffee, saffron, and even psychoactive European mushrooms. However, in the 1930s, a version of the mushroom cult mentioned in the 16th century was documented in the state of Oaxaca, mushrooms included. Later on, mushroom awareness, worship, and even cults would form out of research published in the 1950s regarding Central and South American mushrooms that were used for spiritual and eventually recreational purposes. So, after much backing and forthing, the consensus was that yes, the so-called flesh of the gods being consumed by Aztecs and recorded by those Spanish despoilers and religious scholars were actually mushrooms. Along with the more exciting transgressive mushroom encounters, there were also accounts of locals who ate a fungus that grew on corn, some even cultivating it deliberately. This, of course, has become something of a gourmet item in our modern times, huitlacoche. As this fungus has spread as a modern specialty food in the U.S., huitlacoche has been adopted as a much more enticing marketing term over the original American English name, corn smut. But it's the next episode that's really going to be dedicated to mushroom eating in America and what our problem with them might have been. For this one, I'm going to return and talk about just what is a mushroom and a broader history of mushrooms and people before there was much cultivation. So just what is a mushroom? As a kid, I was told it's not a plant and it's not an animal. And considering that this change in classification happened during the lifetime of my parents and teachers, telling me this makes me glad that scientific literacy can be taken seriously. But defining things entirely by what they aren't doesn't really help anyone move forward. So what is a mushroom? It turns out that they are a fruiting body of a class of fungus. What? Well, let's call up the organizational spirit that inspired Linnaeus and start looking at categories. There's non-living stuff like rocks, and living stuff, the group of stuff on Earth that eats, excretes waste products, and reproduces. I'm not going to get more specific than that because it gets real weird around the edges. But in the comfortable middle ground of the living stuff on Earth, things are divided up into kingdoms. Initially, that was fairly simplistic. Plants and animals. But because now that we have microscopes and people have been seriously contemplating this issue for about 500 years, there are more distinct groups. Plants and animals was proposed as a scientific idea in 1735 and was already disrupted in 1866, which was when microscopes came into play. The general application of microscopes to the classification issue caused all sorts of further discoveries to happen. And along with better microscopes, there were people looking at what wasn't fitting. And those people started asking new questions based on the things that just didn't fit. The first discovery in the microscopic world that really altered the classification of living things was the recognition that there are two very distinct types of cells, those that have a nucleus and the ones that don't. Further study into things like single-cell behavior versus multi-cell behavior set off some further interesting wrangling in the biological community. Then, as humans developed methods for recording the order chemicals were strung together in DNA, and were able to see repeated patterns there, further categories were established. As far as what's important for a mushroom episode, while there's some disputes of how to sort things at the very tippy top, here in the year 2025 of the Common Era, it is pretty well agreed that when it comes to cells, there are three kinds: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria are single cells that don't have a nucleus. It means their DNA is just wandering around loose in the cell with the rest of the cell's stuff. Then there's archaea. These are weird organisms that also don't have nuclei, but are also fundamentally different from bacteria. If you were educated mostly before about 2010, you would have heard of them as archaeobacteria. They are strange and fascinating little critters we still don't know much about yet, but they've been around maybe as long as bacteria or maybe for less time. We have a ways to go in sorting this puzzle out, but to give you a quick snapshot of just how strange archaea are, the very first ones were discovered in volcanic hot springs and continue to be found in places that people once thought, surely nothing could live here. But it's that third group, Eukarya, that is the ones we know best because it includes us. Eukaryotes are the cells with a nucleus. The living things made with this sort of cell is currently divided into 5 kingdoms. These include the familiar animals and plants, and fungi were separated out and given the dignity of their own kingdom only in 1969. Yeah, later than I thought as well. The 2 newest divisions that used to be lumped together when they were noticed in 1866, they were given their own 2 kingdoms in 2015. These are Protista and Chromista. Protista are single-celled living things that can't make their own food, so they go out and eat stuff. This means they were initially referred to as single-celled animals. Chromista can make their own food with chloroplast-like organelles, which is where chlorophyll lives in plants, and this makes them more like plants, so they were initially referred to as single-celled plants. Among other places, you can find a whole bunch of these little guys living with plankton in the ocean and hanging out in pond water, where there are lots of fishes and plants and things like that. Okay, so now we know that fungus is one of the 5 kingdoms of living things that is made of eukaryotic cells. That's the kind with the nucleus. And we know it's not a plant, not an animal, or one of the other ones. So what is it? Well, it's helpful to look at what fungus does and what it's made of. Fungus cannot make its own food like plants. It's not an autotroph or a self-feeder. Instead, more like animals, it's a heterotroph. It has to go out and get stuff to eat. It was this fact that made people start to make the argument initially that fungus was definitely not a plant. But everyone was also pretty sure that fungus was not an animal. I mean, it doesn't go out and chase down and grab food. Further, animals surround food with their body one way or another. They open up a mouth of some sort and put bits of food in. Fungi, on the other hand, decomposes complex molecules into simpler ones outside of their bodies, and then they use tendrils to absorb the simpler nutrients into its cells. While this admittedly could sound a bit haunted housey and gross, remember that fungi are the reason the earth didn't suffocate under a pile of dead plant and animal matter right off the bat. Fungi have taken on the role of decomposer. They disassemble dead things into nutrients so they can be recycled into other living systems. Nutrient cycling for survival before anyone had given the term a name. Now, like most plants, the only way fungi move around is by growing. Though there are some spores, their reproductive units, that can travel on the wind, and some have little wiggly tails or flagella that help them swim a bit. Fungi have cell walls like plants, though in plants, that's made of the carbohydrate cellulose. We are surrounded by cellulose, but tend to notice it in things like the strings in celery and as paper and when it's spun into rayon fabric. Unlike plants, the rigid material in fungi is a chitin-glucan complex. Glucans are another carbohydrate found in plants, but chitin is a molecule that's found in animals. Chitin is a tough, long-chain polysaccharide, which is basically a bunch of glucose sugar molecules with an amine group slapped onto it. Just as with cellulose, you also live surrounded by chitin. It's what makes up the exoskeleton or shells of arthropods. That is, the crunchy part of spiders, centipedes, insects, all the bugs, as well as shrimps, crabs, lobsters, and even the extremely cool but long extinct trilobite. Most kinds of fungus can reproduce using both asexual and sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is basically cloning, while sexual reproduction is the combining of genetic material from at least two sources to come up with a new combination. Many fungi tend to go with the cloning method when life is good. I mean, why mess with what's working? However, when the fungi are stressed, low on food, too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, etc., that's when they tend to go with sexual reproduction, the recombination of their chromosomes from more than one source to see if they can come up with something that works better in a challenging situation. This is not a hard and fast rule, but it is a useful general guide for understanding the multiple ways fungus reproduce. So at this point, it feels like the nature of fungi is very a little bit of this and a little bit of that when compared to stuff we are more familiar with. But that is largely due to the fact that all 5 kingdoms of living things have evolved from those earliest eukaryotic cells. Well, they're working with lots of the same biochemical machinery. All of these kingdoms, fundamentally, are wildly similar at the molecular level, and so sometimes we are really reduced to talking about fungus in terms of how they are and aren't like plants and animals, because those are the things we are most familiar with. But I've been talking about fungi generally, and while mushrooms are part of the greater category of fungus, not all fungi are mushrooms. Mushrooms are the sporocarps, or fruiting bodies of certain varieties of mycelium. Much in the same way, some plants produce fruits from the main body of the plant as a way of spreading seeds. Some fungi will send out a mushroom. Plants have a root system underground to soak up water and some important minerals, but almost all of the production of the sugars that the plant needs to grow and feed itself is done by the chlorophyll in the chloroplasts in their leaves, up above ground. This internal production of sugars from the energy of the sun to make sugar from water and carbon dioxide is what makes plants autotrophs, or self-feeders. But fungus don't have chloroplasts. This is why they can, and pretty much always do, grow in the dark. They are heterotrophs, just like animals. They've got to go out and get food. It's just that most humans don't notice fungus doing this, since most of where fungus gets its food is just out of sight. The type of fungus that makes mushrooms is a multicellular net of mycelium, a fuzzy, thread-like distributed mass that is its main body. And these threads grow around dead materials to decompose it by extending and growing more mycelia. Along the way, many will also manufacture a few of the huge pharmacopoeia of chemicals mushrooms produce. Now, some of these are poisons, sure, but many of them are the compounds that give mushrooms the smells and flavors people love. You can easily go find some mycelia anywhere growing things are. Lift up a layer of damp leaves, or the bark of a tree, or look at the roots of plants in moist dirt. Quite often there are fuzzy threads of fungus interwoven with the roots of other plants. Any single network of mycelia can possibly spread unimaginably far and wide as long as the environment is hospitable. There are networks that have been shown to spread under and within large stands of forests. The largest identified mycelium colony recorded lies in the Blue Mountains of Oregon. Because it has spread by continuously growing from one source, it has the same DNA from one end to the other. And it's been confirmed that it's all the same organism because it will merge with itself. If it were a collection of separate cloned individuals, that wouldn't happen. Now, this huge colony of fungus currently covers about 4 square miles or 10 square kilometers. That comes out to a little over 1,600 football fields of either flavor. How long this particular organism has been in place is up for some debate, but it lies somewhere between 2,500 and 8,000 years. Other large fungus have been found living within and under other large swaths of forests in Washington state and Michigan. It, of course, begs the question of whether even larger specimens could be lurking under the forests of places with less encouragement for primary research. The huge taiga pine forests of Russia come to mind. And while the extreme, large, and old nature of these fungus are fascinating, it's really the other innovations that have been developed while researching these living things that matter to us humans. There have been advancements around DNA identification, chemical signaling in fungus and plants, and how they are affected by environmental changes, and how the signals can change environments. The parasitic and symbiotic relationship between plants, animals, and fungus all give us clues about how to work with nature better instead of simply fighting it all the time. So on the above ground scene, mushroom time happens when the mycelium decides or receives a signal from the surrounding environment. I'm not sure what to call it, because how processes in fungus are started is a wide, cool, and currently poorly understood piece of fungus natural history. But anyway, when it's time for the mycelium to spread their spores, they produce a fruiting body. That is, a mushroom containing the spores. Then the spores can be spread by wind, water, animal agency, pretty much in all the ways seeds are spread in plant fruits. Mushrooms can range in size from a pinhead to diameters of 6 feet or almost 2 meters. And yet, every single one starts as a nearly microscopic nodule on a mycelium. A protective universal veil covers the body of the mushroom. When the mushroom is ready, it bursts out of this veil, and you can see the veil still intact on the very most expensive matsutake mushrooms, and it is often still closed on some button mushrooms. It's a thin, white membrane that still connects the cap to the stem, closing off the spore-containing gills. Examples of places where the veil has been burst are evident on portobello mushrooms, which, after all, are simply larger, more mature versions of the brown cremini mushrooms found alongside the white button mushrooms in most grocery stores. The cremini and especially button mushrooms are still curled up tight, holding in their gills, while the portobellos have opened up, flattened out, and are showing off their gills. The most famous veil remnants, though, are the white spots on the cap of the Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric mushroom. This is the toxic mushroom that is the pattern for every white spotted mushroom cap that is the universal symbol for fairy tale mushroom. The mushroom itself, it is in fact all red. It is the last bits of that white protective veil it bursts through that remain stuck to it and show up as the white spots. Humans have been knowingly working with and actively cultivating plants for a long time. On the other hand, our control of where and when mushrooms and fungus grow is actually pretty short. I mean, yes, we've been harvesting mushrooms for over 11,000 years. Look back at episode 142, where I mentioned the elaborate stone complexes at Göbekli Tepe. But commercial cultivation of mushrooms, controlled in fields or bins or rooms humans built for the purpose, only got started in Europe somewhere in the late 17th or early 18th century. And it seems initially in France, more or less under the rule of the Sun King, Louis XIV. During that time, there was much interest in getting nature to fall into the same organizational scheme of the realm, much the same way it was being applied to his human subjects. And Louis was simply mad for gardening of all sorts. I get a little vague here because there are few histories of edible mushrooms in English. And despite mushroom eating being a global phenomenon, these books tend to be very Eurocentric. Other than passing mentions on topics like Chinese cultivation of shiitake mushrooms 800 to 1,000 years ago, or a vague mention of a tradition of eating hallucinogenic mushrooms in Egyptian religious rituals, what's going on in the rest of the world and their historical association with mushrooms is left largely unexplored. Anyway, mushroom and fungus cultivation is pretty new to human endeavors. And since American food history has much more to say about cultivated food, that is, crops we grew rather than what we foraged, it's no wonder much of the written record of this time regarding mushrooms is limited. I mean, after all, the other ubiquitous food fungus, yeast, was only purposefully cultivated knowing what it was in the middle of the 19th century. Until then, both brewers and bakers had to go catch yeast from the wild and then maintain their own strains. Yeast cultivated specifically for sale was only developed in Austria as a response to beer brewers switching to largely bottom fermenting yeast. Bottom fermenting yeast can raise bread, but it is incredibly slow. Before some technology changes, top fermenting yeast had been the industry standard, and it had been largely interchangeable for bread and beer. But as brewing technology evolved, desirable beer and bread yeast qualities diverged. I suppose if you want to get very technical, beer brewers did cultivate yeast for sale to bakers, but that was more of a side activity, not a primary one that would develop into its own industry specifically for the purpose of harvesting, packaging, and selling it. Anyway, humans have probably been eating mushrooms for most of our history, even though the first generally agreed upon documentation is only about 11,000 years old. And mushrooms had a wide variety of uses. They were food, yes, and people seem most interested in documenting their medicinal and ceremonial roles, but much like corn, they played a part where they weren't ingested as well. Some of the woodier, textured mushrooms work as fire starters. When dried out, they make good material to nurture those first flint-struck sparks into a fire. Mushrooms are also responsible for a wide range of dye colors. After all, mushrooms themselves can be found in every conceivable color, starting with a pure white, including some that even give off an eerie green glow in the dark. There's every shade of brown you can imagine, but they also come in red, yellow, and a vivid blue. There are bright orange lobster mushrooms and a range of pinks and purples as well. There are even mushrooms that come in shades of green, but without the aid of chlorophyll. And yes, the green mushroom is poisonous. The mycopigments that can be harvested from mushrooms cover as wide a range of shades as mushrooms themselves. So there is definitely more written about mushrooms as medicine and hallucinogens, but these histories are more often wrapped up in the rituals and societal consequences. As a result, what has been written about the much more pedestrian food and daily life of mushrooms, at least in English language sources, is spotty and somewhat neglected. And I keep emphasizing English language for two reasons. One, that's what I'm reading. And because this is the history in English, the result is that both English and early American food cultures were somewhat mycophobic. America has generally been culturally wary of mushrooms, but that seems to be changing somewhat in the present. But in the past, we held a lot of reasons in our collective culinary consciousness that made mushrooms, like horses and rabbits, an uncommon and somewhat fringe food in early America. The more we learn about fungus as a kingdom of life, the more I start to feel like Earth may just be the planet of the mushrooms, and humans are just being tolerated. So I think it's time for us to get right with the fungus and work with them. Next time, I'll turn to the early 19th century North American relationship with mushrooms, particularly that of colonists and early American immigrants, since most of the native North American knowledge of our prodigious mushroom population was largely flattened. And I need to stay on my brief, down the middle, more or less, or I shall get so very quickly lost. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episode helps me know that you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or that you at least find it interesting. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.